Well, great. Well, welcome back to NeurIPS and welcome back to our workshop on machine learning and education. We're going to do this a lightning round, which is a conversation with three young technologists who are all working on education. And the reason I'm sort of excited about this conversation is one of the goals for why we're doing the workshop in general is, this is an emerging field. There's actually not that many people who are actually sitting at the intersection of using advanced computational methods and also thinking about education. And as more and more people start to learn data science and machine learning, we want to attract that new community of technologists to the space. And so what better to actually interview some of them, many of whom I work with, so this will be easy for me, about what intrigues them about this space. So we have just a few minutes for this conversation, but I really want people to take two things away. One is that there's lots of ways that one can actually contribute. And second, you should feel free to reach out to them and others and figure out what their experiences are and how you can get involved. So why don't we do this as a little bit of a round robin? So Katherine, tell me a little bit about, who you are, what does it mean to be a Schmidt Futures APM, and what have been some of the ways that you've been working on education already?
So as Kumar said, I'm Katherine. I'm an associate product manager at Schmidt Futures, which is a rotational program that uses the APM model from Google to embed young technologists in social impact organizations. And I recently just started a rotation working with CommonLit, which is a nonprofit in the education sector that has some of this learning engineering mission. And it's been super interesting because CommonLit provides this opportunity to do an intersection of product, impact, and innovation, because it's at this really broad scale. So they have something like 10,000 or 10 million teachers using this platform. And so when you do product development for it, you're impacting millions of teachers on a daily basis. And through that, there's also the innovation in the product is actually, in a lot of ways, innovation in learning and science. And so they're trying to think through, like, how do you apply advancements in cognitive research to students? And in order to actually have the impact, you're tracking, is it working? Like, does this feature actually change how students are learning? Which is incredibly exciting because it means as we do more product development, I'm simultaneously trying to figure out, like, how can you get more students learning how to read better? So CommonLit is a reading platform. And so I'm still in kind of the first month of that rotation, but it's something I've been really excited about and I'm excited to do more of, especially as they continue to advance this new focus on applying cognitive science research and advancements in cognitive science research actually into features of a platform that's impacting 10 million teachers across the US and other countries.
Yeah, and so why don't we go next to Michelle? Michelle, why don't you say a little bit about who you are? And then, I feel like you did some of this work when you were in school, and I'd be curious what you sort of thought about, machine learning meets education when you sort of studied in school compared to your experience now working on it.
Yeah, so I'm Michelle, and I recently graduated from Stanford, and I'm also an APM, like Katherine at Schmidt Futures, working with Kumar on the learning engineering team. And it has been interesting. I think while I was in school, I worked on a project under Professor Emma Brunskill and Professor James Landay called Smart Primer. And it was basically figuring out how to create a narrative-based learning platform for kids. And I was really surprised when I came to Schmidt Futures and found out, the learning engineering space and the space for machine learning and education is kind of small. It was smaller than I had thought because there were connections across Schmidt Futures and the lab that I worked in. I think one thing in particular that I found interesting was, since I just wrapped up my educational journey so far up till grad school, it has been really interesting seeing this next wave of learning technology and how all of this can influence students in the future. So one of the things I've been working on with Schmidt Futures is helping to run the tools competition, which is basically a competition to find projects to help advance learning engineering and reduce COVID-related learning loss. And I think that has been really cool just to see all the different brilliant ways people are working on this type of technology and ways that my own educational background, both as a student and as someone who loves technology, can contribute to that. So there's a lot of ways for us to contribute, and I hope other young technologists like me can also join in.
That's great. So JMac, why don't you tell a little bit about yourself, how you sort of, what you've done before, how you sort of ended up being an impact fellow and working with us. And then, I feel like you've been doing some really interesting work around like, a bunch of projects that now are starting to intersect with education. So you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm Jonathan. I also graduated from Stanford, and I guess my work as an impact fellow kind of intersects with the work that Schmidt Futures does. So just to kind of go over what we do or what I do is like we have a belief that we want to create infrastructural change and kind of close gaps in learning. And one initiative that I've kind of helped launch is this thing called ImageNet for X. So just as how ImageNet was super effective for computer vision, and was like a foundational data set for object recognition, we kind of created this initiative called ImageNet for X, which is also equally ambitious to kind of close these gaps within different boundaries of industries. So we want to push especially the boundaries of education, NLP and NLU. And what that's kind of led us to is kind of two main projects. The first of which is kind of children's speech recognition, kind of helping to assess the landscape of kind of who's working on speech recognition, but also simultaneously use that to improve speech recognition in children and to build better conversational agents. And also in terms of writing, collecting writing samples, and also be able to assess that to create a more like robust autograder to kind of also cope with the learning loss or improve remote learning.
And what sort of jumped out to you? I mean, I feel like both some of the work you've done in sort of just mining the huge number of machine learning papers that are out there and everything else, what sort of jumped out to you about education as a subfield in this area?
Yeah, so education definitely is a very large like field, and it's really exciting to kind of see a lot of the research that has been kind of blossoming these past few years. A lot of new conferences in linguistics especially are starting to apply a lot more of these modern NLP and NLU techniques to kind of understand exactly how people learn, how people engage, and how to close like gaps within the community.
Yeah, so I'd be curious, just why don't we do this as a quick round with everybody, as where it's just like, what's something that's just like jumped out to you that's been surprising to you? I feel like Katherine, one of the things, you're still sort of digging into CommonLit, but just that, there are these platforms that are so big, they're operating at this large scale, which might lend themselves to these new capabilities versus how much room there is for someone to actually make a difference. Like, I'd be curious what sort of jumped out to you sort of early on as to like education specifically.
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting is it's a lot of former teachers, especially at CommonLit. And so when I said like, oh, I'm going to come in as a product person, they were like, oh, that's awesome. Like, we don't have people from the technology sector. And so trying to build in best practices in technology is really new. And so like CommonLit in particular was a paper first. So they started with PDFs and are now building out their digital platform more and more, and are really excited to have people who come from the tech world figure out how do you like up level that technical component of the PDF based curriculum components.
That's great. And Michelle, what's your sense on like, let's say somebody's in graduate school, they're undergraduate in computer science or something else. Do you have sort of thoughts now that you've started to dig into the work around, people always have a little bit of imposter syndrome. I'm sure everything's figured out. I'm sure, like, what would be ways they could get smarter about how to sort of wander into the space?
I'd say to not underestimate the power of even just cold emailing or getting into contact with someone you admire. I think that if you see someone who's doing work that you're very interested in, just reaching out, and especially I think people are very willing to help students and young people. So just go for it.
That's great. And JMac, what's your sort of sense on, like this idea that, there's a bunch of these new sort of methods. Is there some place where you would sort of recommend people to sort of check out more? Is there like a conference that really jumped out to you when you were reading the papers?
Yeah, for sure. So there are a bunch of new like linguistics conferences that have been popping up recently that are really interesting, such as LREC. That's a super big one. But I think I'm just really excited about the fact that a lot more people are kind of seeing the intersection of how to apply a lot of the newer developments in language models and kind of like apply that to education, learning, and teaching.
It's great. Well, like I promised everybody, this was going to be a flash session. I want to really thank this amazing panel for sharing their insights, and I hope like people both reach out to them, but also are inspired just like I am by like how much there is to do and how much folks were at the sort of beginning of this revolution. And so, thank you so much for joining us.